The stage from Rourke's Ford pulled away, and a young woman stood alone in the churned dust of a mountain street, with her father's coat folded over one arm. Above the rooftops, a shoulder of granite leaned toward the town, as if listening for the name she had come 3 weeks to speak. When she asked the liveryman about the Callaway Company, his hand froze halfway to the peg, and he told her softly that she would do well to ask nowhere at all. At the land office, they laughed and sold her a ruined shelf of frozen mountain for the price of the back taxes, $9.40, certain she had bought only wind and graves. On the feed store porch, a man in a fine slate coat watched her count out the coins, promising to buy the worthless deed back the day she came down, if she came down. At the edge of town, an old woman on a cane chair lifted one finger and warned her to mind which snow she turned over. High on the shelf that night, her horse pricked its ears toward a collapsed wagon and would not look away. Inside the cabin waited a beam of fresh-cut wood that had no business standing in a house 40 years abandoned. What would you do if the only road worth taking was the one an entire valley had agreed to forget? A company of settlers who climbed into the high country one autumn and were never again counted among the living. This is the story of a young woman named Della Ainsworth, 23 years old, who rode into Harrow Bend with a borrowed saddle, a folded scrap of paper, soft as cloth at the creases, and the name of a company nobody there wanted spoken aloud. What she uncovered on that snowbound shelf, and what the older families had kept buried for 40 years, would unsettle every quiet corner of that town before the season turned. Stay close. Settle in. Tell us where you are watching from tonight, because the wind-up in Harrow Bend does not carry the truth down the mountain easy, and you will want to hear this one from the first step. The stage from Rourke's Ford let her off at the head of a rutted street just as the daylight thinned to the color of old brass. Della stepped down with her carpet bag in one hand and her father's coat folded over the crook of her other arm. And for a long moment, she did nothing but stand in the churned dust and look up. Harrow Bend sat in a bowl of pines beneath a shoulder of granite, so tall it seemed to lean over the rooftops the way a man leans in a doorway to listen. Wood smoke drifted low along the eaves. A dog barked once behind a paling fence and thought the better of it. She had come a very long way to stand in a street where no one knew her face. 3 weeks it had taken her, by wagon and rail and stage, and before that 1/2 year of stillness in a rented room in Iowa, sitting late at the kitchen table with the last of her family's papers spread across the oilcloth. Her mother had gone in the spring, her father the winter before that. The two of them worn thin and by a hard little farm that had never once paid them back for their trouble. Between them they had left her a modest stack of letters bound in string, a wedding daguerreotype gone silver at the edges, and a single sheet in her mother's careful hand that named a company, a year, and a place. Callaway Company, 1845, Harrow Bend. Her mother's elder sister had gone up the mountain with that company, a girl of 17 named Aveline, newly married and bright with it. She had climbed into the pines with her husband and had not come down. For 40 years, the family had spoken of her only in the softest of voices, the way a person handles a cup that has already been cracked once and might not survive a second fall. Della tightened her grip on the carpet bag and started up the plank walk toward the livery. The liveryman was an older fellow with a white mustache and one milky eye, and he took her board money without ever quite meeting her look. When she asked, low and even, whether he had ever known any of the Callaway Company, his hand stopped halfway to the peg where he hung his receipts. That name. The words came out of him slow, as though he were setting down something heavy. Been a long while since I heard it spoke plain. He pushed the paper onto its nail and wiped both palms down the front of his apron, though they were already dry. You'd do well to ask elsewhere, miss. Then, quieter, and with something almost like kindness folded into it. Or nowhere at all. She thanked him and stepped back into the last of the brass light. A wind came off the shoulder of the mountain and pressed cold against her cheek, and Della Ainsworth, who had held her mother's hand while it went from warm to still, drew one long breath and did not shiver. She had come to learn where Aveline had spent her final winter. She had not come to be turned aside at the first closed door. The boarding house at the end of the street was kept by a widow named Mrs. Halloran, who took one look at Della standing in the lamplight of the entry and set an extra plate at the table without asking a single question. That night, Della slept beneath a wool quilt that smelled of cedar and lye, and in the gray before dawn she dreamed of a wagon wheel half sunk in snow, turning slowly though nothing pushed it. In the morning she walked to the land office to ask after the old trail up the gap. The clerk was a narrow man in a stiff collar, and he peered at her over the rims of his spectacles as though she had tracked something unpleasant across his floor. His name, painted in flaking gilt on the pebbled glass of his door, was Pettigrew. When she named the Callaway Company, he laughed. It was a short, dry sound, not cruel exactly, but pleased with its own cleverness. The Callaway Ghosts. He set his pen down as if to give the joke his full attention. That is what you have come all this way for. I have come for a trail, Della said. There is no trail, miss. There is a shelf up past the second switchback where some fools once tried to winter over. Rotted timbers. Snow half the year, ice the other half. The county deeded that whole claim off decades back for taxes owed on it, and not one soul has paid a nickel to look at it since. He tapped a knuckle against a leather ledger, and a small smile began to work at the corner of his mouth. In point of fact, should you have a mind to throw good money after dead men, I could sign the thing over to you this very morning for the back taxes on it. $9.40. It would be yours. Behind him, a second man in shirt sleeves snorted into a tin cup of coffee. Della set her purse on the counter and counted the coins out one at a time onto the wood. The clerk's smile faltered and went out. He had not expected her to do it, and now that she had, he wrote out the deed slowly, pausing between lines as though hoping she might yet come to her senses. When he slid the paper across to her, the ink was scarcely dry. Miss. His voice had lost its edge of amusement. There is nothing up there but wind. Then I have bought wind, Della said, and folded the deed into the breast of her coat over her heart, where the folded page in her mother's hand already lay. Out on the porch of the feed store, 3 men had watched the whole of it through the wide front window. One of them came off the porch as she passed, broad through the shoulders in a fine wool coat the color of wet slate, and up close he smelled of bay rum and pipe tobacco, and his boots were far too clean for a man who claimed to know the country. He touched the brim of his hat without a particle of respect behind the gesture. Miss Ainsworth. He had learned her name already, which told her the town talked faster than it walked. Ellis Callaway. I believe you have just bought yourself a piece of my grandfather's foolishness. She held her empty hands still at her sides and looked at him steadily. That shelf has stood for sale 40 years, he went on, enjoying the shape of his own words. You are the first soul poor enough, or fool enough, to take it off the county's hands. He smiled with only the front of his mouth. I will buy it back from you for $1 the day you come down off that mountain, if you come down. I will remember the offer, Della said. See that you do. He tipped the hat a second time and turned on his heel, and the 2 men still on the porch laughed the low, obliging laugh of men who are being watched by the one who signs their wages. But there was a fourth figure Della had not marked at first, standing back in the shadow of the store's awning, where the light did not reach. Older than Ellis, thinner, with a face like a closed ledger, he had not laughed and had not spoken. He only watched her the way an assessor watches a field he intends to buy cheap, and when her eyes found him, he did not look away. She learned his name that evening at Mrs. Halloran's table, spoken with a small drop in the widow's voice. Royce Callaway. Ellis's uncle, the one who truly held the family's papers and its purse, and who, folks said, had never in his life let go of anything that had once passed into his hand. At the last building before the road bent away toward the timber, an old woman sat on a cane chair in a narrow strip of afternoon sun. She wore a black shawl and a white kerchief knotted beneath her chin, and her hands were folded on the head of a walking stick, worn smooth and pale as bone. Della had not seen her on the way into town. She would not have missed her twice. The woman lifted a single finger from the stick as Della drew even with the chair, a small gesture that was neither quite a wave nor quite a blessing. Della stopped. The old woman's eyes were the pale gray of river ice in April, and she took her time. She studied Della's face, then the folded coat over her arm, then the deed's clean corner just showing at her breast. Child. Her voice was dry and formal, an old voice that had learned long ago to spend itself carefully. The mountain kept them because someone down here needed them kept. Mind which snow you turn over. Della opened her mouth, found she had nothing ready, closed it again. Ma'am, I don't. You will, the woman said. In your own time. She lowered the finger back to the head of the stick and turned her gaze toward the granite ridge. And Della understood, without a word passing between them, that the audience had ended. She dipped her head and walked on. When she glanced back from the second bend of the street, the cane chair sat empty, and the sun had slid off the wall behind it, and no one on the plank walk seemed to have noticed a woman rise and go. Word of the deed climbed the street faster than she did. By the time Della reached the livery, the boy holding the bridle of her horse had already heard, and he looked at her the way children look at a person about to walk out onto thin river ice in the first week of spring. She thanked him and swung the borrowed saddle true, checked the girth twice, and lashed her carpet bag behind the cantle with slow, practiced fingers. Her father had taught her to pack a horse the way a careful man packs for a war he does not expect to win. And the town watched her do it from the plank walk, without her once turning her head to catch them at it. Two women stood in the doorway of the dry goods, with their arms folded over their aprons, and one leaned to murmur to the other a word Della could not hear and did not need to. A man leading a mule across the road drew the animal wide of her as though whatever she carried might be catching. She heard the word ghosts pass twice on the air before. She had cleared the last hitching rail, and she gathered it up and put it away with the rest, and gave no sign. The horse was a plain bay gelding named Barley, 7 years old, sold cheap back in Rourke's Ford because he had a habit of standing dead still when other horses ran. She had liked him at once for exactly that. He blew twice at the green smell of the pines and settled his weight into the grade, and Della let him find his own pace, because the road began to climb almost from the last fence post, and did not think of leveling. It climbed along a creek bed that ran shallow and stony between low banks of alder, and within the hour the town below had shrunk to a scatter of roofs and a suggestion of smoke laid thin against the tan floor of the valley. The trail was not so much a trail as the memory of one. In places she could pick out the old ruts where wagon wheels had scored the ground 4 decades back, filled now with fallen needles and the neat print of deer. In other places the mountain had forgotten the wagons entirely, and she had to ride by the lay of the land itself, by the way a slope wanted to funnel a body upward, by the notches in the rock where iron rims had once scraped, and left a faint bloom of rust on the granite that no rain had ever fully washed away. The second switchback came on toward dusk, a hard elbow of stone where the creek fell off to her left in a white ribbon, down into blue nothing. Above it, the timber thickened and drew close, and the air lost a full coat of warmth all at once. She smelled the shelf before ever she saw it. Old smoke, though nothing had burned up there in a lifetime, old iron. The flat mineral cold of a place where deep snow had lain long and heavy, year upon year, until the ground beneath had forgotten every other season. Barley lifted his head and slowed of his own accord, and Della let him choose it. The shelf opened out of the timber the way a held breath opens into a quiet room. It was wider than she had braced herself for, half an acre at the least of level ground, caught between the mountain's shoulder and a sheer drop into evening air. The last of the day laid a band of copper light along the crown of the ridge above and left the shelf itself lying in a long blue shadow. At the far edge stood the cabin, or what 40 winters had left of one. The roof had sagged along its ridge until the whole structure looked like a horse gone sway-backed in its old age. The door hung crooked on a single hinge, and its wood had been silvered by so many seasons that it stood nearer to bone now than to timber. Off along the north edge, she could make out the humped, collapsed outlines of 2 smaller structures gone almost back into the earth, and beyond them the gray ribs of a wagon tilted at the sky, like the skeleton of some patient animal that had lain down and never risen. Della sat the saddle a long while without dismounting. She had told herself on the ride up that she would surely feel something the moment she arrived, some rush of grief or recognition, and she was quietly surprised to find that what came instead was the cold sliding down out of the pines and a great tired stillness, as though the shelf had been expecting her for a very long time and was in no hurry now that she had finally come. She swung down at last and led Barley slowly out across the open ground. She did not go into the cabin that first night. Something in her declined it, the way a person declines to open a stranger's letter before she has knocked at his door. She unsaddled the horse in the lee of a fallen wall and rubbed him down with a twist of dry grass, then staked him where the last daylight still kept a little warmth in the soil. She built a small fire against a slab of granite and set water to boil in a tin cup and ate a piece of bread and a wedge of hard cheese from the carpet bag. She wrapped her father's coat over her shawl and sat with her back to the stone and watched the dark cabin across the clearing while the blue hour came down over everything. The wind rose after full dark. It came off the higher slopes with a slow breathing sound, and it moved through the broken roof of the cabin and made a soft, hollow music in the ruin, as though the old timbers were still trying to recall what a whole house had once sounded like. Some while past midnight, Barley lifted his head and pricked both ears toward the collapsed wagon and stood that way a long minute, motionless, before he let his head sink again to graze. Della watched him do it. She marked the exact direction his ears had pointed against the field of stars, and she said nothing, and she filed it away. She slept at last, with the deed still folded against her breast, and she did not dream of the turning wagon wheel that night. She dreamed instead of a woman she had never met, standing in a lit doorway with one hand held out into the dark, waiting for someone to come in out of the cold. Morning came thin and gray, frost silvering the grass, a slow steam rising off Barley's back where the early sun found him. Della woke stiff along one hip and lay a moment, looking up through the pines at a sky the color of skimmed milk. Then she rose, banked the coals, warmed her hands over them, and walked at last across the clearing to the cabin. The door did not so much open as lean aside when she pressed her palm to it. Inside, the air was colder than the air without, and it carried the smell of long dust and the faint iron-sweet ghost of old smoke. A packed dirt floor, a stone hearth split down its middle by some hard winter's freeze, a plank table on which someone had left a tin plate, turned face down 40 years before, and had never come back to set it right. Two bunks along the north wall, their rope webbing rotted through and hanging in gray strands like unbraided hair. In one corner, a small wooden toy horse hand-carved, its mane suggested by a few careful strokes of a knife, the whole of it no longer than her hand. She stood a long time in the doorway before she crossed the sill. She did not touch the plate. She did not touch the little horse. She walked once slowly around the room, with her hands at her sides, and let her eyes rest on each thing, and let the cabin, in its turn, take a long look at her. It was on her second circuit that she saw the beam. The ridgepole overhead had sagged, which she had already read from below, but inside the sag ran the wrong way, and that stopped her where she stood. The pole itself was sound old pine, dark with its years, and it ran the length of the room the way a ridgepole should. Yet where it met the west wall, it did not rest upon the top log, as its far end rested on the east. It rested instead on a shorter beam laid crosswise and notched into the wall, and that crosswise beam was newer wood. Not new, not fresh, but newer by 10 years than everything around it, perhaps 15. The grain of it was a paler color. The marks of the adze along its underside were finer, made by a steadier and more patient hand. Someone had come back to this shelf after the caravan, after the killing winter, after the town below, had written the whole claim off and turned its face away, and that someone had climbed up here and set this beam in place, and had done it carefully, and had meant it to hold. Della stood beneath the beam and looked up at it for a long while. Then she looked at what the beam was set to cover. Above it, where the roof boards met the ridge, a small square of the ceiling had been cut clean and fitted back again. The seams of it were tight. The nails were square-headed and rusted. Yet their rust was plainly younger than the rust that for the rest of the old roofing. She did not climb up to it. She did not go out for a tool. She only stood beneath the square and let the fact of it settle down through her the way a dropped stone settles through still water, slow and certain, all the way to the bottom. Outside, Barley stamped once against the frozen ground. Della went out to him. She laid her hand flat along the warm slope of his neck and stood a moment, and together they looked across the clearing at the tilted ribs of the wagon, and past it at the two collapsed structures, and past those at the low mounds along the north edge that she had not yet let herself count. She had counted them already, though without meaning to, on her walk to the cabin at dawn. There were 7 of them. 7 mounds, near even in their size, near even in their spacing, with stones set at their heads that had once stood upright, and now leaned this way and that like tired old men at the end of a long day. She did not go to them yet. That, she understood, would come. But it would come in its own time, and not before she was ready to give it the whole of her attention. She went back to her fire instead, and fed it, and boiled more water. And she sat with her hands wrapped around the warm tin and thought about the beam, about the hands that had cut it, about what kind of person climbs back up to a place the whole world has agreed to forget, and hides a square of ceiling, and sets a fresh beam under a rotting roof, and then goes away again and tells no one. That first full day she did not act. She sat with the shelf and let it be what it was. She walked its edges once, slowly, marking where the drop began and where the timber closed in, marking the seep at the south end, where a thread of water still ran even now beneath a lace of ice. She learned the shape of the ground the way her father had taught her, to learn the shape of a horse, before ever she threw a saddle across it, patiently, giving it no reason to fear her. By dusk she had not touched a single tool. She had only looked and listened, and the cabin had gone on, watching her look. Have you ever come to a place you had never seen and known, in the soles of your feet, that it had been waiting for you? That night, when Barley again lifted his head toward the wagon in the small hours, and held it there, long past the point where a resting horse would let it fall, Della marked the exact line of his ears against the stars a second time. It was the same line as the night before. Not the wagon itself, she thought. Something just beyond it. The next morning she began to work, and she began with the small, honest things, because she did not yet trust her own hands with the large ones. She cleared the hearth of 40 years of pack rat leavings, scoop by scoop into a tin bucket, and carried the bucket to the lip of the drop and tipped it into the wind. She swept the dirt floor with a bundle of pine boughs bound at the butt with a strip torn from her petticoat. She lifted the face-down tin plate at last and set it upright, and beneath it she found a small measured pile of dry beans, gone black as coal with the years, laid out the way a person lays out a supper they mean to cook the moment the water boils. She did not throw the beans away. She folded them into her apron pocket, and she could not have said why, only that it seemed a wrong thing to scatter them. She mended the door. She had no proper tools yet, only her clasp knife and a length of soft wire from the bottom of her bag. But she wired the broken hinge back true to its post, and when she pushed the door it groaned once, and then held solid against the frame, and the small victory of it warmed her more than the fire had. Have you ever set your hand to something broken and felt, through your palm alone, the exact moment it decided to hold? She rested her forehead against the mended wood, a breath longer than she needed to, and then she got back to it. She cleared the smaller of the two collapsed structures, the one nearest the cabin, pulling the fallen roof timbers aside one at a time and stacking them clear. It had been a lean-to for stock. In the packed earth of its floor she turned up an iron horseshoe with 3 of its nails still driven home, and a leather buckle gone green with time, and at the very back, where the roof had come down slowest and sheltered the ground, longest, a wooden spoons whose handle bore a shallow, careful cross cut into it with the point of a knife. She carried the 3 things into the cabin and set them side by side on the plank table without fully knowing why she did it, only that they seemed to belong together, and to belong indoors, and to have been out in the weather long enough. Barley followed her from task to task through the short, bright afternoon. He grazed where the sun warmed a patch of old grass, then lifted his head and ambled over to wherever she had settled, and stood a few paces off with one hind foot cocked, watching her work with the mild, endless patience of a horse who has decided a person is his to keep an eye on. When she stepped into the cabin, he came and put his head in at the doorway and blew once, long and soft, into the dim. When she came out, he touched his muzzle to her shoulder, and she leaned her cheek into the warm hollow above his eye for the length of one breath, and then went back to it. By the end of that third day, she had the cabin swept, and the door hung true, and the hearth clean, and a small stack of split kindling laid ready by the stone. Her palms were raw, and her back ached in a good, clean, earned way she had not felt since the last spring she had worked her father's fields beside him. She sat at the plank table in the failing light, with the horseshoe and the buckle and the cross spoon set out before her, and she looked at them a long time, and her hands had already learned something that her mind had not yet said out loud. Someone had lived here after the winter. Someone had come back and made a home of the ruin, and used the hearth, and carved a cross into a spoon handle, and set a fresh beam under a failing roof, and hidden a square of ceiling. Above her in the blue dusk, the newer wood held its silence, and the small clean square in the ceiling waited, and neither would tell her anything until she went up and asked. She rode down to Harrow Bend on the fourth morning for tools and for flour, telling herself it was only that, and knowing it was also this, that a question had lodged in her like a splinter under a nail, and the answer to it, or the beginning of the answer, lay in that town at the bottom of the trail, among people who had spent 40 years teaching themselves not to speak of it. The town had heard she meant to stay. She read it in the way the plank walk cleared a half step ahead of her, in the way conversation dropped a register when she passed and rose again behind her back. At the mercantile, the storekeeper filled her orders civilly enough. A hatchet, a pry bar, a small crosscut saw, a sack of flour, a twist of salt. But his eyes kept drifting to the mountain in the window, as though it might be listening. Folks say you've took up on the Callaway shelf, he offered, wrapping the salt. I've taken up on my own shelf, Della said. I paid for it. No arguing the deed. He tied the string. It's the rest of it there's arguing over. She let that lie where he had dropped it and paid him and carried her tools out into the street, and it was there, loading the pry bar into Barley's near saddlebag, that she felt the weight of a man's regard settle on her back. She turned. Royce Calloway stood across the street in the shade of the bank's awning, both hands resting on the head of a silver-topped cane he plainly did not need for walking, watching her with that same closed-ledger patience she had marked her first day. He did not cross to her. He did not tip his hat as his nephew had. He only looked and let her feel herself being looked at, and when she met the look and held it, he inclined his head a fraction, the smallest possible acknowledgement, the nod a man gives a problem he has decided is worth the trouble of solving. Then he turned and went into the bank, and the door drew shut behind him, and the brass bell over it rang once and went still. Ellis found her before she left. He came out of the feed store buttoning that fine slate coat against the noon chill and fell into step beside her without invitation. 4 days, he said. I confess I'd have wagered on 2. You'd have lost, so I gather. Something moved behind his easy manner, some current she could not yet name, running counter to the words on top of it. That shelf did for better provision parties than one woman and a lazy horse, Miss Ainsworth. My grandfather buried a company up there. 29 souls went up. My family does not speak of the number that came down, and I have never known whether that is grief or something else. Della stopped and turned to face him full on, the pry bar's cold iron against her hip. What number came down? For just a moment the ease went out of his face entirely, and she saw beneath it a younger and less certain man, one who had asked himself that same question in the dark and had never been given an answer he could live with. Then the coat and the manner closed back over him like water over a dropped stone. That, he said, is exactly the sort of thing a person ought not go digging after up on a cold mountain alone. He touched his hat. My offer stands. $1 the day you come down, and Miss Ainsworth. He had gone 3 steps before he turned back, and his voice had dropped so that only she could hear it. If my uncle should send word up that mountain, or send a man, you would do well to be off it, and back down here where there are witnesses before that word arrives. That is not a threat. It is the nearest thing to kindness I am able to offer you, and keep my own footing in this town. Then he was gone across the street, and Della stood holding a pry bar in the cold noon sun, with the taste of a warning in her mouth. And she understood that she had walked into something older and heavier than a worthless deed, something the whole of Harrow Bend was still leaning its weight against 40 years on, and that whatever lay behind the square in the ceiling of that cabin was the thing they were all, in their different ways, leaning against. She stopped last at the very edge of town, at the low building where the old woman had sat in her cane chair on the first day. The chair was there. It was empty. She asked a boy sweeping the step whose grandmother sat there, and he looked at her with an honest and total bewilderment. "Ain't nobody's grandmother sits there, miss?" he said. "That chair's been empty long as I can recall. My pa keeps meaning to burn it for kindling." Della thanked him and rode out of Harrow Bend and up the switchbacks in the failing afternoon with a hatchet and a saw and a pry bar and a great many more questions than she had carried down, and the words the old woman had given her turned over and over in her mind the whole climb. Mind which snow you turn over. She thought she had begun now to understand the first half of it. Someone down here needed them kept. Ellis had all but named it in the street. Royce had all but confirmed it with a single unhurried nod from the shade of a bank he owned. Somebody in that valley had spent 40 years needing the Callaway Company to stay lost, and she had ridden into town with a folded page in her mother's hand and paid $9.40 to start turning over the snow. The shelf, when she reached it, lay quiet and blue in the early dusk, exactly as she had left it. Barley walked to the mended door and put his head in and blew, and Della unloaded the tools and stacked them against the wall. And she stood a while in the swept and ordered room she had made of the ruin, looking up at the pale crosswise beam and the clean square of ceiling above it that she had, so far, only looked at. She was ready now. She had earned the right to it, she felt, by mending the door and clearing the hearth and reading the shape of the ground, the way a person earns the right to open a letter by first carrying it a long way. She set the plank table upright directly beneath the west wall. She took up the pry bar in one hand. Then she stood on the table with the fresh beam close above her head and set the flat end of the bar to the nearest seam of the fitted square, and the wood gave the smallest breath of movement, a whisper, a promise, and a fine curtain of 40-year dust came sifting down through the last of the light onto her upturned face. The wind was rising again off the higher slopes, and beyond the mended door the 7 leaning stones stood dark against the snow-streaked north edge of the shelf, waiting the way they had waited 40 years. Della turned her cheek from the falling dust, drew a breath, and pried. The square lifted free, with a sound like a held breath finally let go, and a slab of cold dark air came down out of the roof to meet her. She set the pry bar across the beam and reached up into the hollow between the roof boards and the ridge, and her fingers found tin first, cold and ridged and flat on top, small enough to close a hand around. She brought it down into what was left of the light. It was an old tobacco tin, the painted red on its lid worn to a memory of itself, the whole of it held shut by a wrap of waxed cord gone stiff with the years. She stepped down off the table and carried the tin to the doorway and sat on the mended sill with the last of the day crossing her lap, and she worked the cord loose with fingers that were not quite steady. Inside lay 3 things: a folded square of oiled paper, a stub of pencil worn down to the length of her thumb, a lock of dark hair bound at one end with a single strand of blue thread. She set the pencil and the hair on the sill beside her and unfolded the oiled paper across her knee. It had been doubled twice, and it had gone brittle along every crease, and she opened it the way a person opens something that cannot be folded a second time if it tears. The hand upon it was small and slanted and careful, the writing of someone who had possessed both time and cold fingers. and had made her peace with the pace the cold set. Della read the first line, and then she read it again, because the first reading had gone through her too fast to hold. I am Avalon Calloway, and I set this down while my hand still answers me. She lowered the page to her lap and looked out across the darkening shelf. Barley stood at the edge of the clearing with his ears forward and his weight still. The wind moved once through the pines above and then held itself, as though it too had come to listen. She raised the page and read the rest of it slowly, one line at a time, giving each line room to settle, before she let her eyes travel on to the next. The letter said that the company had come up the shelf in October of 1845, 7 wagons and 29 souls, bound for a valley on the far side of the pass that a man had sworn to them was green the whole year round. It said the snow had come 6 weeks early and had come to stay, that the pass had closed behind them in a single night while they slept, that by the second week they understood no wagon would cross it again until the spring thaw let it. It said that the men had held a council by firelight and had made the only decision that decent people could make, which was that the children would not spend the winter on that shelf. It said that the 4 strongest among them had broken a path down the mountain through snow to the waist, while the way was still barely away, and had carried and led every child of the company down to the valley, every last one, and 2 of the nursing mothers besides, and had put them into the hands of families in the town below, before the drifts sealed the trail for good. Aveline had written the children's names in a careful column down the side of the page, so that whoever found the letter would know. They had been counted and had been carried to safety. And Della ran her thumb slowly down the list of them and felt something in her chest come loose. Since the first day, she read her mother's page in the Iowa kitchen. Not lost then, not the children. They had gone down into warm houses while the pass was still passable, and it was 7 grown men and women who had stayed behind on the shelf to keep the wagons and the stock, and to wait out a winter they believed they could outlast, and who had been wrong about their own strength and right about their children's chances. Have you ever carried a grief so long that the lifting of even a corner of it makes you dizzy? Della pressed the heel of her hand to her breastbone and breathed until the shelf steadied around her, and then she read on. The letter said that of the 7 who stayed, the winter had taken them one by slow one through the deep cold of February, when the last of the flour was gone and the game had left the country entirely. It named them, 7 names, and Della understood that she was reading the register of the 7 leaning stones out along the north edge. It said that a party had come up from the valley in the softening days of April and had found her alive in the cabin, the only one of the 7 still drawing breath, and that they had brought her down the mountain, wrapped in every blanket they carried. She had lived. She had walked back into the world on another's arm and then on her own feet, and she had done it, she wrote, because she had been carrying a child, and a body will spend the last of itself keeping 2 hearts going where it would let one stop. The son had been born in the town below in the June that followed, in 1846, and she had named him Wesley for her own father. And here the letter turned, and its careful hand grew harder to read, pressed deeper into the paper, as though the pencil had been gripped tighter. It said that a man had come to her that first summer wearing a fine coat, when she was newly a widow with a newborn, and no standing and no kin within 1,000 miles, and that this man had put money on the table between them, once to keep her silent, and again to make her go, and that she had taken neither. It said the man's name was Josiah Calloway, that he had been the captain of the company, that he had been one of the 4 strong men who carried the children down the mountain and had then not climbed back up to the 7 who waited. It said that when the valley asked him what had become of the company, he had told them, all the rest were lost, every soul left on the shelf and every child besides, and had told it so steadily and so long that the town had folded the whole caravan up like a bad memory and put it away, and had let him do it. And it said the reason a man tells such a lie is written in a ledger, because the claims those 29 souls had filed on the good bottomland, along the far creek, reverted to no one, so long as no one came down alive to hold them, and reverted very readily to the one living man who could swear to the county that their owners were dead. Della sat very still on the sill, with the page trembling faintly in the last light. The name at the head of the fine slate coat had a grandfather now, and the grandfather had a shape. And the shape was a man who had carried a company's children to safety with his own 2 hands, and then buried the truth of everyone else for money, and had grown so rich and so respectable on that buried truth that his grandson still owned the bank 40 years on. The letter's final passage was not grief and was not accusation. It had gone quiet, the way a voice goes quiet when it has said the hard thing and turned at last toward what matters. Aveline had written that she meant to raise Wesley's up on the shelf where the air was clean and the town's talk could not reach him, and that when her own strength began to fail, whenever that day should come, the boy was to be taken down to a family named Dean at the low end of the valley. Good people who had promised to take him in without ever once asking whose child he was. She had asked that whoever found this letter should carry it to the town and read it out plain, so that 7 names might be spoken again in the open air, and so that a lie 40 years fed might finally be allowed to starve. She had signed it, Aveline, in a smaller hand, and beneath the name a single date, the 9th of August, 1857. Della folded the page back along its old creases and returned it to the tin with the pencil and the lock of hair, and she sat a long while, with the tin closed in both hands, while the blue hour drained down off the ridge, and the first stars pricked out cold and steady over the pass that had shut behind a company of the hopeful 40 years before. She did not weep. What she felt was too large and too old for weeping, and it had settled into her like a second spine, straight and load-bearing. She had come up the mountain to learn where an aunt had spent her final winter. She was going down it, she understood now, carrying the one thing a whole town had spent 4 decades pretending did not exist. She went out to Barley in the dark and put her arms around the warm column of his neck and stood there until her breathing came even. And the horse bore her weight, without complaint, the way he bore everything. And above them the wind came back and moved through the broken roof and made its hollow music over the swept and mended room, where a woman had once measured out beans. For a supper she meant to cook the instant the water boiled. She did not sleep much that night. She lay wrapped in her father's coat with the tin beside her hand and turned the letter over and over behind her eyes. And near the turning of the night she rose and went out under the hard stars to where Barley stood, because he had lifted his head again toward the tilted wagon, and this time he did not let it fall. She followed the line of his ears out past the gray ribs into the dark at the edge of the timber, and there, at the base of a leaning pine, where a horse's patient nose had scented what 40 years of townsmen had never come up to look for, the ground lay wrong. Not a mound, a hollow, a shallow dish of earth over which the pine needles had drifted unevenly, the way ground settles above something that has slowly given way beneath it. She marked the spot in her mind, against the pine and against the wagon, and went back to the cabin and did not dig in the dark, because whatever was down there had waited 40 years and would keep until she could see her own hands. Morning came with a low sky the color of pewter and a smell in the wind that her father had taught her to read, the flat, wet smell that runs ahead of snow. She had meant to go down to Harrow Bend that day and read the letter out in the street, as Aveline had asked. The sky changed her mind. A woman caught on the switchbacks in the first hard storm of the season with a horse and a tin box would help no one, and the letter had kept 40 years and could keep another day for the price of her not dying on the trail. She would dig instead while the light held and go down when the weather broke. She took the hatchet and the pry bar out to the leaning pine and cleared the drifted needles with her boot and knelt and worked her fingers into the cold seam of the hollow. The earth came away in frozen clods for the first hand's depth, and then softer beneath, where the frost had not reached, and a foot down her knuckles struck iron. Not the tin softness of a buried cup, flat, hard, unyielding iron and a broad expanse of it. She cleared the dirt back with the hatchet blade and bared the lid of a strong box, black iron banded and riveted, the size of a small trunk, its hasp closed by a lock the size of her fist that the years had welded shut with rust. Someone had buried this deep and buried it to stay, and had set it far from the cabin where a casual searcher would never think to turn a spade. Out at the dark edge, where only a horse who loved a person enough to keep watch over her would ever have found it. She could not lift it. She could barely rock it in its bed. She worked at the frozen ground around it until her hands would no longer close, and she got the box free enough to see that it was whole and that the lock would not give to anything she carried. And then the first flakes came slanting down out of the pewter sky, dry and small and in earnest, and she knew the day was spent. She dragged a fallen limb across the open ground to mark it and to keep Barley from stepping into the hollow in the dark. And she went in. The storm came on through the afternoon the way the wind had promised, sheets of snow moving sideways across the clearing so that the 7 stones vanished and the wagon vanished, and the world narrowed to the swept room and the fire she fed. She brought Barley into the cleared lean-to and wedged the mended door tight with the length of split pine, and she sat with the tin in her lap and the strong box, his rusted lock turning in her mind, and she listened. To the cabin, take the weather the way it had taken 40 winters of it, the ridgepole creaking once along its length, and then holding on the pale beam a stranger's careful hands had set beneath it. It was past full dark, with the storm at its worst, when she heard the horse. She thought first she had made it out of the wind, the way a tired mind makes voices out of running water. Then it came again, nearer, the sharp report of a shod hoof striking bare stone at the head of the switchback, and beneath the wind a man's voice, thin and cracked, and calling a word she could not shape into sense. She pulled her father's coat around her and took up the lantern and dragged the door open into the storm. A horse stood swaying at the edge of the clearing with its head hung to its knees and its flanks heaving, snow-crusted white along its mane. A rider was slumped forward over the pommel with one hand locked in the mane and the other hanging dead at his side. Della went out to him through snow that was already past her ankles. The lantern held high, and she took the bridle and turned the exhausted animal toward the lee of the cabin, speaking low the whole way, the flat, steady sounds a person makes to a frightened creature to tell it, the worst is over. The rider lifted his head at the light. It was Ellis Calloway, and the fine slate coat was soaked black and stiffening, and there was rime in the 2 days' growth of his beard. And his eyes did not fix on her at first, but swam past her toward the fire glow in the doorway, as toward something he had stopped believing in. He tried to speak, and could not make the words hold together. Della got her shoulder up under his arm and eased him down out of the saddle, and he came down heavily, all his weight at once, so that she staggered and braced and took it, and half carried and half dragged him across the threshold to the hearth. She laid him on her own blanket by the fire. She stripped the frozen gloves from his hands and the ice-stiff boots from his feet, and chafed his hands hard between her own until the deathly gray of them gave way to a blotched and painful red. She warmed water in the tin cup and held it to his cracked mouth, and he drank it in slow swallows with his eyes shut. Then she went back out into the teeth of the storm and brought his ruined horse in beside Barley under the lean-to and worked the ice out of its coat with a twist of dry grass and threw her own wool shawl over its steaming back, because a man who rides a horse near to death in a blizzard has still left her a living animal to save, and she would save what could be saved. When she came back in, snow to her knees and her lashes frozen, Ellis was watching her from the firelight, and something in his face had broken open that his easy town manner had kept shut. His voice, when it came, was barely a voice at all. "Why would you go back out for the horse?" Della knelt and fed a stick to the fire. "Because 40 years ago somebody didn't go back," she said, "for the 7 who waited." He shut his eyes, and a long shudder went through him that was not entirely the cold. The wind pressed its shoulder against the door, and the door held on its mended hinge. And Della sat with her back against the plank table and the tin within reach of her hand and watched the man breathe, until the breathing steadied and lengthened towards sleep, and outside the snow went on falling over the 7 leaning, stones, and over the opened hollow where a black iron box lay half out of the ground under a fallen limb, waiting for the morning, and for a key that did not exist. The storm blew itself out somewhere in the small hours. Della woke to a hard white light lying flat across the clearing and to Ellis sitting up against the cold hearthstones with the blanket around his shoulders and his eyes red at the rims. He had been awake some while, she saw. He had found the tin. It sat closed on the table where she had left it, and he had not opened it, but his gaze kept going to it, the way a man's tongue keeps going to a broken tooth. "I came up," he said at last, "to see whether you'd gone through the floor." He turned the cup in his hands without drinking. "My uncle sent a man to the livery yesterday morning, asking who had guided you up here and by which trail. He does not send men to ask idle questions. I told myself I'd ride up and warn you, and ride back before the weather turned." A short breath left him that might, in a warmer room, have been a laugh. "I have never in my life read a sky correctly." "You read this one wrong nearly to the last," Della said. She set water to heat. "What does your uncle mean to do?" "I don't know that he knows yet. That is what frightens me." He looked at her directly, and the town veneer was wholly gone now, burned off by cold and fear and the long, dark ride. "You have to understand what you've walked into. My grandfather built everything this family has out of that mountain. The bank, the bottomland, the name. I grew up on the story that the whole company was lost to the winter, that it was a tragedy, and no fault of ours, that we simply endured where others perished. Every man in that town below has grown fat or thin in the shade of that story for 40 years. And you rode in 3 weeks ago with a scrap of paper and paid $9 to start pulling the roof beam out from under all of it." Della crossed the room and took the tin from the table and stood over him with it in both hands. And she watched his face while she made her decision. Because a thing read out to the wrong man in a lonely place can be unmade with a single toss into the fire. But she had already seen him ride a horse to the edge of death to warn a stranger, and she had already heard him ask why she would save an animal. And a man who asks that question is not yet the man his grandfather was. "Then you had better hear what you built it on," she said, and she sat down across the hearth from him, and she opened the tin, and she read. She read it all, from the first steady line to the last, and she did not soften the passage about the fine coat and the money laid twice on a widow's table, and she watched what it did to him. When she came to the 4 strong men who broke the trail and carried every child down to the warm houses of the valley, his head came up, because that was a piece of the family story he knew and was proud of. And when she read on, that one of those 4 had been Josiah, and that Josiah had come down a hero with the company's children in his care, and had then told the valley that everyone else was dead, so that their good land would fall empty into his hand, Ellis Calloway put the flat of his palm against his eyes and held it there, and did not take it away for a long time. "He saved the children," he said finally, from behind his hand, and his voice had the wonder of a man watching 2 truths he could not reconcile stand side by side and refuse to cancel. "That part is true. He truly did carry them down. My grandfather brought every child of that company off that mountain alive, and then he sold the graves of the ones who stayed for Bottomland and let me grow up believing him a martyr." "A man can do a brave thing and a low thing with the same 2 hands, Della said. "Most men who do great harm have done some good first. It is what lets them sleep." He lowered the hand. His eyes were wet and clear. "The coat," he said. "The one Aveline wrote of. The fine coat he wore up here, with money in both pockets." He looked down at the ruined slate wool, draped stiff and drying over the hearthstones beside him, at his own coat, the coat of a Calloway man of standing, and Della watched the understanding go through him like cold water. "It came down to my father, and then it came down to me. I have been wearing it in that street all my life." They went out together into the blinding morning. The storm had laid a foot of new snow across the shelf and rounded every hard edge of it, and the 7 stones stood out of the drift like the knuckles of a buried hand. Della led him to them and told him the 7 names off the letter, and Ellis Calloway knelt in the fresh snow at the head of the row and cleared the face of the nearest leaning stone with his bare hand until the hand went red and then white. and he read the weathered scratches that 40 years had nearly erased, and he stayed there on one knee, saying nothing until Della touched his shoulder and he rose. Then she took him to the opened hollow at the edge of the timber and swept the new snow off the fallen limb and off the black iron lid, and she watched his face change a second time that morning. "I know this box," he said slowly. He crouched beside it and laid his gloveless hand flat on the frozen iron. "Not this one. Its brother. There is one exactly like it in the vault beneath the bank, and my uncle is the only man alive who holds a key to that vault. My grandfather had a pair of them cast in Rourke's Ford the year the company was lost. I have seen the receipt for the ironwork in the old ledgers, and never once thought to ask what the second box was for or where it had gone." He looked up at her, and the fear that came into his face now was of a different order than the fear of the storm. "If what your aunt wrote is true, and if this box holds what I think a careful man buries at the far dark edge of the very shelf off where the truth is buried, then my uncle has spent 40 years, Katina, sitting on the twin of the thing that could hang the whole story around his neck, and he has been content because he believed the mate to it was gone into the ground forever with the rest of the company. And now a stranger has dug it up," Della said, "and word is going to reach him that she did." Ellis got to his feet. The new snow had begun to soften at the surface where the morning sun struck it. And far down the valley, small and clear in the cold, still air, came the sound she had been listening for, without knowing it, the thin, distant chime of iron on stone, of shod hooves working steadily up the frozen switchbacks. Not one horse, several. He heard it the same instant she did, and every remaining trace of the drawing room went out of him. "That will be his man," he said, "or his men." He did not wait for the weather. He would not have. "He has known since yesterday that you found something up here worth guiding for, and he does not intend for it to come down this mountain in your hands." He turned to her, and for the first time he was not a Calloway of the bank, but only a frightened man who had chosen a side in the last dark hours and now had to live inside the choice. "The box cannot go down the trail, not the way they're coming up it. And it cannot stay in the open where they'll find it in an hour's searching." Della was already moving. The letter she could carry against her heart, where no man would find it without laying hands on her, and any man who laid hands on her to search would answer for it in the town below, where Ellis Calloway would by then be a witness. But the box was another matter. The box was iron and heavy, and the proof entire, and she would not let it fall back into the vault it had been cast to fill. She thought of the swept cabin and rejected it, the first place any searcher would tear apart. She thought of the drop at the shelf's edge and rejected that too, for a thing thrown down could be climbed down to. Then her eye went to the spring seep at the south end, where a thread of water still ran even now beneath its lace of ice, to the deep cold pool it fed among the rocks, where no man riding up to seize a strongbox would ever think to wade. "Help me," she said, and Ellis came. They dragged the box from its hollow through the wet snow by main force, the two of them hauling on a rope she ran through the rusted hasp, and the iron left a dark furrow behind it across the white. At the seep they broke the ice with the pry bar and sank the box into the black water among the stones until it settled out of sight, and Della scattered loose rock over the place and let the running water carry a skin of new ice back across the surface. And within the hour, she judged, the mountain would have hidden it again as thoroughly as it had hidden it for 40 years. She marked the spot by three things only: a split boulder, a dead snag, and the angle of the noon sun off the ridge, and she fixed them in her memory and told them to no one, not even to the man beside her, because what only one person knows cannot be pried from a second. They filled the empty hollow with snow and dragged the limb back over it and stamped the furrow flat, and they were inside the cabin with the fire built up bright and innocent, and barley, and the two spent horses, standing quiet in the lean-to, by the time the riders came off the last switchback onto the shelf. There were three of them. They came across the clearing at a walk, their horses blowing hard from the climb, and the man in the lead sat his saddle the way a man sits, who has done such errands before and found them simple. He drew rein a dozen feet from the door and looked at the swept threshold, and the smoke going straight up from the mended chimney, and at Ellis Calloway, standing in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, with his coat drying inside, and something flickered across his face that had not planned on finding a Calloway of the bank already up the mountain ahead of him. Mr. Ellis. He touched his hat brim. Your uncle didn't say you'd be up here. My uncle doesn't say a great many things, Ellis answered, and his voice had found its town evenness again, laid now over something harder underneath. What's your business on Miss Ainsworth's land, Rourke? Her land. The man let the words sit and turned them over, as though testing them for soundness. Mr. Royce understood there was some question about that deed. Sent us up to look into the particulars, and to see was the lady in any difficulty, up here alone, after such a storm. His eyes moved past Ellis to Della where she stood by the hearth, and went from her face to her hands, to the closed and ordinary tin on the plank table, and lingered there a half-second too long before they came back. Difficulty of any kind. The lady is in no difficulty that 3 men on her land at midday would improve, Della said. She had not raised her voice. She stood easy with the fire at her back, and the letter flat and warm against her heart beneath 2 layers of wool, and she let the man look at the tin all he liked, because the tin held a lock of hair and a worn pencil and a folded page that named him nothing, and its true weight had gone into black water an hour past. You've climbed a long way to ask after my health. You've seen it's good. You can tell Mr. Royce Calloway I thank him for his concern, and that I'll be bringing the particulars of my deed down to the town myself, in my own time, and reading them out where the whole street can hear. The man Rourke sat still in his saddle a moment, and the shelf was very quiet around them. Only the drip of melt off the eaves and the blowing of the tired horses. And Della understood that a scale was being weighed behind his flat and careful eyes. The weight of what he had been sent to do, set against the fact of a Calloway standing witness in the doorway, and a woman who did not frighten, and a mountain that had already very nearly killed 1 rider that week. Whatever the letter of his orders, the arithmetic of doing the thing here, now in front of Ellis, had gone wrong for him, and he was man enough to know it. He gathered his reins. I'll carry your message down, miss. The courtesy was a thin skin over something that had not gone away, only been deferred. Mr. Royce will want to hear it from you direct, I expect. He's a great one for hearing things direct. He backed his horse and turned it, and the 3 of them rode off the shelf the way they had come, unhurried, in no retreat, and the last Della saw of them was the lead man's head, turning once at the head of the switchback, to fix the caravan and the seep and the whole white shelf in his memory the way a man fixes a place he fully intends to come back to. Ellis let out a long breath only after the sound of the hooves had faded into the valley below. He'll tell my uncle you found something and hid it, and that I helped you do it. He rubbed a hand hard down his face. There is no road down off this decision now, for either of us. There was never going to be one, Della said. She was already gathering the tin, already reaching her father's coat down from its peg, because the weather had broken and the men had gone, and the letter had waited 40 years, and would wait no longer whatever came up the trail behind it. You said your uncle likes to hear things direct. Then he'll hear it direct. We're going down to Harrow Bend, Mr. Calloway, the both of us, and we're going to stand in the street where you've worn that coat all your life, and we're going to read 7 names out into the open air, and after today, no man in that valley will ever again be able to say they were never spoken. Outside, the sun had climbed clear of the ridge at last and lay full and bright on the melting shelf, and the seep at the south end ran on beneath its healing skin of ice over the thing it had swallowed. And Barley came to the doorway and put his head in and blew, ready to carry her down whatever waited. And Della Ainsworth folded her father's coat over her arm and stepped out into a light that had not fallen so plainly on that mountain in 40 years. They came down the switchbacks through the softening snow with the sun at their backs, Della on Barley and Ellis on the borrowed horse, that had strength enough left for a careful descent, and the town of Harrow Bend rose up out of the valley to meet them a good deal sooner than it had let her leave. Word had climbed the trail ahead of them somehow. In that way, news travels in mountain country through channels no one can quite name. And by the time they reached the last fence post, the plank walk was no longer empty. Faces stood in doorways. A knot of men had gathered outside the feed store, where Ellis had first come off the porch to mock her. And they did not mock now, because a Calloway of the bank rode down the mountain in his shirt sleeves beside the woman they had called a fool, and the sight of it rearranged something in the street before a word was spoken. Della drew rein in the middle of the rutted road, at the exact center of the town, where the bank stood on one side with its brass-belled door and the land office on the other, with Pettigrew's flaking gilt name, and she did not dismount. She meant to be seen. She had carried the letter down against her heart, through a foot of new snow, and past 3 men sent to take it from her. And she would not now read it out from some corner where the words could be swallowed. She took the tin from inside her coat and opened it in the cold sunlight so that every soul on that street could see. There was nothing in her hands but paper and a lock of hair. And she began to read Aveline's letter out into the open air of Harrow Bend, slowly, from the first steady line, in a voice pitched to carry to the far end of the walk. The street went still as she read. The knot of men by the feed store did not move. Mrs. Halloran came out onto the boarding house step, with a dish towel forgotten in her hands. When Della read the column of the children's names, the ones the 4 strong men had carried down through the drifts into the warm houses of the valley, an old man near the mercantile took off his hat and held it against his chest, because one of those names had been his own, carried down a boy of 4 and grown gray in a town that had told him his whole life he was the last orphan of a company that had perished to the final soul. When she read that Josiah Calloway had come down a hero and then told the valley all the rest were dead, so that their bottom land would fall empty into his hand. A sound moved through the gathered people that was not quite a gasp and not quite a groan. The sound of a town hearing the floor of its own history give way beneath it. The land office door opened. Pettigrew came out onto his step with his spectacles in his hand, and his narrow face gone the color of tallow, and he did not laugh. He had laughed at her the first morning and offered her a mountain for the price of a joke. And now he stood listening to the joke turn into a reckoning, and when Della finished the last line and the date beneath the name, he spoke into the silence in a voice with nothing left of its dry cleverness. I have the company register in my office. The roll of the Calloway party filed the autumn they went up. I have had it 40 years. He swallowed. It has the names. It has her hand on the marriage line. I can bring it out and lay it beside that letter, and any man here may compare them. Bring it, Della said. He went in for it, and the street waited, and it was into that waiting that the bank door opened, and Royce Calloway came out. He had not hurried. That was the first thing the street understood about him in that moment, that a man whose family's whole foundation was being read aloud in the road outside his window had taken the time to set his hat and take up his silver-topped cane before he came to the door. And he came now without haste, without heat, a tall, thin man, in a good black coat descending his 3-stem to the cold. As though into a meeting, he had called himself. His eyes found Ellis first, bareheaded and coatless on a spent horse at the woman's side, and something passed across his closed ledger face that was colder than anger, the particular contempt a hard man keeps for his own blood when his own blood has failed to be hard. You've been busy, nephew. He did not raise his voice, and the street leaned in to catch it. Up the mountain in a storm to warn a squatter. Down it again to hold her horse while she slanders your grandfather in the public road. He isn't slandered, uncle. Ellis's voice was quiet, but it did not waver, and Della heard in it the sound of a man who has spent a night rearranging every certainty he owns and has come out the far side settled. He's finally described. There's a difference, and you know it better than any man here, because you've spent your life making sure no one learned to tell them apart. Royce turned from him as from a thing not worth the breath and set his attention on Della. And it was the full weight of it now, the assessor's regard she had felt across the street her first day, come to make its offer at last. You've read a dead woman's grievance to a crowd, he said. A woman 40 years in the ground. with no witness living to say her hand wrote true. No proof of a single claim in it beyond the say-so of paper any clever person might have penned last week in a cold cabin with a worn pencil. His gaze went to the tin, dismissed it. You've stirred a great deal of feeling, miss. Feeling is not a deed. Feeling does not undo 40 years of clear title recorded in that office behind you. By nightfall, the feeling will cool, the street will empty, and you will still be a bankrupt orphan who paid $9 for a graveyard. And I will still hold every acre my grandfather filed. The only question left worth your asking is what I am willing to pay. To spare us both the tedium of the months, it would take you to learn that in a courtroom. It was the same offer, Della understood, that had been laid on Aveline's table twice in the summer of 1846, once to keep silence and once to go, come down through 40 years and 3 generations without losing an ounce of its cold arithmetic, and the man making it did not even know he was repeating his grandfather or did not care. Your grandfather offered my aunt money on a table, she said, loud enough for the street. Once to be quiet, once to leave. She took neither, a widow alone with a newborn and no kin within 1,000 miles, and she chose to raise her boy on a frozen shelf rather than sell you the truth. You'll forgive me if I don't dishonor her by taking in an afternoon the coin she spent her life refusing. Something moved through the crowd at that, a low current of assent. And Royce heard it. And for the first time, the smooth surface of him showed a hairline crack, because he had built his whole life on the certainty that every person has a price, and that the finding of it is merely a matter of patience. And he had just been told, in his own street, in front of the people whose deference was his true fortune, that the finding had failed. Then you'll have the courtroom, he said, and the softness had gone out of his voice. And you'll find the courtroom is a place where paper answers to paper, and I have more of it than a dead woman's diary. You have a letter. I have a register of death, filed and sworn and stamped by the county 40 years back, that lists every soul left on that mountain as deceased. Sworn testimony, miss, of record. Against my sworn record, you have a widow's penmanship and a crowd's wet eyes. I will see you in the county seat, and I will bury you in exactly the manner my family buries things, thoroughly and by law. He had meant it to close the matter. He had meant the words register of death to fall on the street like a stone and end the noise. Instead, they fell into Della like a key turning, because she had read that letter through more times than she could count, and she knew what it said about the thing he had just named with such confidence. And she understood in that instant that Royce Calloway had made the single mistake a careful man makes only once in his life, the mistake of reaching for the very weapon that could be turned against him. You filed a register of death, she said slowly, and she felt Ellis go still beside her. In 1846, sworn to the county, listing all the company as dead. Every soul. His certainty had not yet caught the danger. It has stood unchallenged 40 years. Then you swore a lie to the county under your own hand. Or your grandfather did, and you have upheld it, Della said. Because 11 of those souls never died on that mountain at all. 11 children were carried down it alive into the houses of this very valley. And some of them are standing in this street grown old, and one of them is holding his hat against his heart, not 30 feet from where you're standing. You did not merely tell a story in a tavern, Mr. Calloway. You put a false roll of the dead into the official record of this county, so that living children's inheritance would fall to your family as though they had perished with their parents. And you have defended that false record for 40 years. That is not a grievance a dead woman scratched onto paper. That is a fraud with a filing date and a county stamp on it, and it is the one thing in this world that a courtroom cannot wave away with wet eyes, because the county's own ledger is the witness against you, and it has been sitting in that office the entire time. The street had gone so quiet that the drip of snowmelt off the bank's eaves sounded like a clock. Royce Calloway's face did not crumble. Men like Royce do not crumble. They calculate, and Della watched the calculation run behind his eyes and watched it come up, for the first time in his life, without an answer, because Pettigrew was even then coming back out of the land office, with a great leather-bound register in his arms. the roll of the Calloway party in one hand, and the county's book of recorded deaths in the other, and any man in that street with eyes could now walk in and lay the two open side by side, and see the names of living, breathing, gray-haired townsmen written in the column of the dead, sworn and stamped in the year 1846 over a Calloway signature. The children, Pettigrew said, and his voice cracked on it, because he was a man who had spent 40 years as the keeper of records without once being asked to read what the records actually said. He set the death book open on the porch rail of his own office for the street to see. Their names are here, in the dead roll, filed as perished. He looked up, and he looked not at Della and not at the crowd, but at Royce, his patron, the man who owned the paper on his own house. I stamped this book when I was a young man. Your grandfather brought me the roll, and I entered what he swore to. I never once counted it against the living. God help me, I have had the proof of it in my own office for the whole of my working life, and I never opened the two books on the same desk. No one did, Della said, and her voice gentled, because the clerk's ruin was not the ruin she had come for. That is how a lie of this kind survives. Not because it's clever, but because it asks so little of everyone. It asks only no one, lay the two true things side by side. Your grandfather understood that men would rather keep a comfortable story than do the small hard work of comparing two ledgers, and he was right about this town for 40 years. She lifted her eyes from the clerk to the man on the bank steps. He was wrong about it today. Royce Calloway stood a long moment with the whole street's understanding settling onto his shoulders, like the snow settling off the eaves. And then he did the thing that told Della more about him than any word had. The thing that separated him finally and forever from the nephew standing at her side. He did not look at the old man holding his hat, whose stolen boyhood was written in the dead book. He did not look at the 7 names, or the children's names, or the widow's letter. He looked at the bank behind him, at the brass-belled door and the vault beneath it. And Della saw him already retreating into it, already reckoning what could be moved, what could be signed away in the night, what could be salvaged of 40 years before the county seat sent men to ask him about a register of death with living names upon it. You will regret, he began, in the low, flat voice of a man reaching for the last threat in an empty drawer, and Ellis Calloway swung down off the borrowed horse into the snow of the road and cut him off. No, uncle. He stood in the street in his shirt sleeves in the cold. A Calloway confronting a Calloway in the sight of the town that had feared the name for 40 years. And he was not loud. And that was what made the street hold its breath. She won't regret it. We will. You and I and the whole of what our grandfather built. Because he built it on a stone he stole out of the wall of these people's lives. And a house built on a stolen stone stands only as long as no one comes to claim it back. Someone has come. She paid $9 for the right, and she climbed the mountain. None of us would climb. And she read the names none of us would read. And it is finished, and the only choice you and I have left is what kind of men we are on the far side of it being finished. You would throw away everything. It was not quite a question. Royce looked at his nephew as at a stranger who had wandered into the family wearing its face. For a dead woman and a squatter's diary, you would hand back land this family has held for 2 generations. Beggar yourself for the satisfaction of a crowd that will forget your name by spring. I would hand back land that was never ours to hold. Ellis did not raise his voice, but it reached the far end of the street all the same. You call it beggaring myself. My grandfather would have called it the same. But he carried 11 children off that mountain with his own 2 hands before he ever told his lie. And I have spent my whole life not understanding how a man could do both, and now I do. And the understanding is this. He did the great good when it cost him nothing, and the great good would have cost him a fortune. And he chose the fortune, and the calling of, he called it protecting family, and the calling of it, that was the worst of the lie. I will not protect this family the way he did. I will protect it by giving back what will otherwise rot it from the inside for another 40 years. That is not throwing everything away, Uncle. That is the only way any of it was ever worth keeping. The words landed in the street and did not scatter. Della, watching, understood that she had not made this happen, not truly. She had only carried a letter down a mountain and laid two ledgers where they could at last be seen together. And the rest had been waiting in these people the whole time, in the old held hat and the clerk's shamed hands, and the nephew's long unease, waiting for someone poor enough and stubborn enough to pay the $9 and turn over the snow. Royce Calloway did not answer his nephew. He turned without another word and went back up his 3 steps and in through the brass-belled door, and the bell rang once behind him and went still. And the street understood that the ringing of it was the sound of a man retreating into a fortress he had just been shown was made of paper. What he did in there in the hours that followed, what he tried to move and sign and save. Before word reached the county seat, the town would learn soon enough. For now the door was shut, and the man behind it was, for the first time in 40 years, no longer the heaviest thing in Harrow Bend. It was then that the old woman came. She came up the middle of the street, from the low end of town where the cane chair sat empty against the wall. And she came slowly, on a walking stick worn pale and smooth as bone, a woman in a black shawl, with a white kerchief knotted beneath her chin. And the crowd parted for her the way water parts, for something it has always known was there beneath the surface. Della's breath stopped in her throat, because she had asked a boy sweeping a step, whose grandmother sat in that chair, and the boy had told her plainly that the chair had stood empty as long as he could recall, that his father meant to burn it for kindling. Yet here the woman came, solid in the cold sunlight, her river ice eyes fixed on Della, and the townspeople she passed drew back not in fear, but in a kind of dawning, dazed recognition, as though a name they had misplaced were rising slowly toward the surface of the town's long memory. "You told me to mind which snow I turned over," Della said, when the woman had drawn even with Barley's shoulder and stopped. Her voice came out lower than she meant it. "You knew. That first day. You knew what was up there." The old woman lifted one finger from the head of the stick, the same small gesture she had made before, neither wave nor blessing. "I was 4 years old, the autumn they carried me down off that mountain," she said, and her dry formal voice reached farther than its softness should have allowed, because the whole street had gone silent to hear it. "One of the children in your aunt's own hand, in that column you read out just now. Effie. The men broke the trail through snow to their chests to bring us down, and they put me into a house at the low end of this valley. And I grew up in a town that told me every year of my life that I was an orphan of a company that had died to the final soul on that shelf. I knew it was not the whole truth. I had walked down. I remembered the cold of it, the man who carried me, the warm kitchen at the bottom. But a child's memory is a thing a town knows how to talk a person out of. And by the time I was grown, I had learned to sit quiet with what I knew and let them have their story, because there was no proof, and there was no one who would climb up to find it. And the one man who could have told it plain had the most reason of anyone alive to keep it buried. "Josiah," Della said. "Josiah." The old woman's hand tightened on the stick. "He carried me down that mountain in his own arms. I have that, too. The same man who saved my life told the lie that stole its truth from me, told the county I was gone with the rest, so the land my parents filed would fall to him. And I sat in a chair at the end of this street for the last of my years watching that family grow rich on the memory of people who trusted them, waiting." Her river ice eyes had not once left Della's face, waiting for someone to come who was not from here, someone the story had never gotten its hands on. "I watched every stranger who stepped off that stage for 30 years, child, and I knew you the moment you set your boot in the dust, because you were carrying your father's coat the way a person carries a thing they mean to keep. And you looked up at the mountain like you had business with it. So I told you to mind your snow." It was all the help an old woman with no proof was permitted to give. Della came down off Barley then, into the snow of the street, and stood before the woman who was living proof, the one witness Royce had sworn did not exist. The child from the saving column made old and come at last into the open. "You could have told me everything that first day," she said, not in accusation but in wonder. "You could have spared me the storm, the digging, The men on the shelf. I could have told you a tale no one would credit from a strange old woman who half the town thinks is a ghost already. Something that was nearly a smile touched the seamed face. And you would have had a story. And a story is not proof. And Royce Calloway eats stories for his breakfast. You did not need me to tell you. You needed to find it. The truth had to come down that mountain in the hands of someone who had earned the right to carry it, or the town would never have believed its own ears. The finger lowered to the stick again. A gift handed to you is a thing men can argue you out of. A thing you dig from the frozen ground with your own hands is yours, and no man living can talk you out of what your own hands have held. The register lay open on Pettigrew's porch rail. The letter was in Della's coat, and now one of the carried-down children of the Calloway Company, grown old and long silent, stood in the center of Harrow Bend and named herself before the whole town. And there was no ledger in any vault that could hold Effie among the dead, while she stood breathing in the road, and Della understood that the case Royce had promised to bury, her under in the county seat, had just lost its foundation entirely. Because the dead do not walk up the middle of a street on a worn stick to correct the record. They did not settle it all that afternoon. A thing 40 years in the building does not come down in an hour, whatever the stories say. But the shape of the ending was set in that street before the sun left it. Pettigrew, who had entered the false role as a young man, spent the rest of that day and half the night in his office with the two great books open on the same desk at last, comparing them line by line as he should have done 4 decades before, entering in careful ink beside each falsely recorded name the correction and the date. And Della understood that the clerk was not only mending the record, but trying, in the only way left to a man of paper, to buy back the 40 years he had kept the proof and never read it. Word went down to the county seat within the week, carried by a rider Ellis himself sent and paid, and men came up from the county to look at the register, with the living names in the dead roll and at the woman who had walked out of that roll into the open air. And what they found could not be waved away. The false filing had a date and a signature, and the signature was Josiah's, upheld through the years by the family that profited from it. And though Josiah himself was long past any court's reach, the land filed on the strength of a fraudulent register did not rest easy in the hands that held it. The bottomland along the far creek, filed by the 29 and stolen by the roll of the dead, was the county's to re-examine now, and the descendants of the company, the old man with his hat Effie, the families who had taken in the carried-down children and raised them as their own, had claims the law could no longer pretend not to see. Royce Calloway did not stay to answer for it. In the days after the reading, he moved what could be moved, signed what could be signed. And when the county's men came at last to ask him direct, as he had once been so fond of hearing things, the bank stood with its brass bell and its emptied vault and its owner gone south on the first stage out of Rourke's Ford. A rich man made suddenly and permanently poor in the only currency Harrow Bend had ever truly paid him, which was the deference of people who had believed his family's story. He kept his liberty, being himself beyond the reach of a fraud his grandfather had filed. But he left behind the thing he had spent his life accumulating, which was standing. And a man like Royce, Della thought, watching the empty bank in the gray morning after he had gone, would find the loss of standing a colder poverty than any court could have sentenced him to. He had traded his family's honor for bottomland when the trade cost him nothing, exactly as his grandfather had, and he had learned, in a single afternoon, in the street, that the market he had cornered was the one market that can turn on a man overnight, because the good opinion of your neighbors is the one fortune you do not hold in a vault, and the one no lock can keep. Ellis stayed. That surprised the town, which had expected a Calloway to run with the Calloway money, and it did not surprise Della at all. He gave back what the law asked him to give, and more that it did not ask, deeding over his own clear-held share of the bottomland to the descendants of the families it had been taken from. And he did it without the courtroom having to make him, which the town noticed, and which began slowly, over that winter and the spring that followed, to change what the name Callaway meant when it was spoken on the plank walk. He did not do it to buy that change. Della watched him closely enough over those weeks to be sure of it. He did it because he had knelt in the snow at the head of 7 leaning stones and read the names off them with his own bare, reddened hand. And a man who has done that cannot afterward hold the land those stones were traded for and call his sleep his own. There remained the box. Della had told no one where it lay. Through all of it, the reading and the reckoning and the county's men and Royce's flight, she had kept the seep at the south end of the shelf, and the split boulder and the dead snag locked behind her teeth. And until the town had shown her what it truly was, she had not been ready to trust it with the last and heaviest thing. Now she judged the moment had come. She rode up the switchbacks alone on a clear, cold morning near the end of that first hard month, with the sun laying gold along the melting drifts, and Barley carried her up the trail he had come to know, as though it were his own dooryard. And at the top the shelf lay open and quiet, and, for the first time since she had come to it, no longer a place that frightened the valley below. She broke the healing ice at the seep with the pry bar, and waded into the black cold pool among the stones, and got the rope through the rusted hasp, and drew the strong box up out of the water it had hidden in. And she dragged it streaming onto the bank, and let the winter sun strike the iron that 40 years of dark had never touched. She had no key. The twin of it lay in an emptied vault. Royce had fled, and the county seat would want this box whole and unopened as evidence of what the register had been filed to conceal, and she meant them to have it that way. But she knelt beside it a long while in the cold before she took it down, one hand flat on the frozen lid, thinking of the careful hands that had cast a pair of these in Rourke's Ford the year the company was lost, one to bury the truth and one to bury the proof of the truth. Both of them iron, both of them meant to keep forever, and only one of them keeping what its maker intended. He thought he'd buried you, she said aloud, to the box, to the shelf, to the 7 stones standing clear of the drift along the north edge, to the woman 40 years in the ground who had set a fresh beam under a rotting roof, so that someone, someday, would have reason to look up. He buried the proof right beside the truth and slept sound on both. He never once thought the mountain might be keeping them for us instead of for him. What the box held, when at last the county opened it under the eyes of witnesses, was what a careful and frightened man buries when he has done a thing he cannot undo and cannot bear to destroy the evidence of, either. The original claims of the company, the papers the 29 had filed on the good bottomland, before ever they went up, each in the hand of the man or woman who filed it, the true and rightful title to every acre Josiah had stolen with a false roll of the dead, a ledger in Josiah's own hand recording, year by year, the income he drew from land that was not his, kept perhaps as a penance, perhaps as a debt he told himself he would one day repay, and never did. And beneath the papers, wrapped in oiled cloth, the pooled money of the company, the common fund the families had carried up the mountain to start their new lives with, on the far end of the pass, gold and banknotes 40 years untouched, buried by Aveline, or by some last surviving hand, and set beside the proof so that whoever found the one would find the other, and would have, along with the truth, the means to make the truth mean something. That fund went where Aveline's letter and the county's slow justice together directed it. To the descendants of the company, to Effie, who had been 4 years old in the snow, to the old man who had held his hat against his heart, to the families who had opened their doors to carry down children and asked no questions, and to the line of Wesley Callaway, Aveline's own son, born in the valley in the June of 1846, and grown and gone before his mother's truth ever came down the mountain. Wesley had married and had lived a quiet, ordinary life a few valleys over, never knowing whose child he was or what shelf he had been born beneath. And he had died the winter before Della ever set foot in Harrow Bend, so near to the truth in time, and so far from it in knowledge, that the ache of the near miss sat in her for a long while after. But he had left a daughter, a gray-eyed woman named Mrs. Dean, now by marriage, raised by the same good family, Aveline's letter had entrusted her father to. And when that woman came at last into Harrow Bend and was shown the letter and told at last whose granddaughter she was, and held the lock of dark hair, bound with blue thread, that had lain in a tobacco tin for 40 years, she wept without a sound the way a person weeps who has been handed a mother she never knew she had lost. The winter went out slowly, the way mountain winters do, giving up the high country an inch at a time. And when the first true break came, when the snow softened on the shelf, and the trail up the switchbacks ran with meltwater, the town of Harrow Bend went up the mountain together, most of it in a slow line that Della led on Barley, with Ellis walking at the horse's shoulder, and Effie borne up the gentler stretches in a cart, and behind them the descendants of the company, and the families who had raised their carried-down children, and Pettigrew with his corrected register under his arm, and a traveling preacher who had offered to ride up and read words over the ground. On the shelf, under a sky the color of washed tin, 7 stones that had leaned untended for 40 years were set upright and true, and Ellis Calloway had paid out of his own diminished purse for 7 fitted markers, cut at the stone yard in Rourke's Ford. And Della had given the mason the 7 names off Aveline's letter to carve, with Aveline's own at the head of the row, and 1 marker, left deliberately blank at the end for any soul the letter and the register together had failed to recover, so that no one who had kept faith on that mountain would be forgotten for want of a name. The preacher read the short words. The town stood bareheaded in the cold, clear air, where 40 years before it had agreed to look away. Effie was helped to the head of the row and stood a long moment before the marker that bore Aveline's name. The woman who had written her own child's name in a saving column and then stayed to keep the truth until someone came for it. And the old woman set her worn stick against the stone and laid both her hands flat on the cold, new-cut face of it and said nothing at all. Because there are debts that no words reach, and gratitude is one of them. Della laid the wooden spoon with its careful cross at the foot of Aveline's marker and left it there in the melting snow. She had carried it down the mountain and back up again, the small, carved thing from the collapsed Linda, and it seemed to her the only fitting offering. A plain tool made beautiful by a patient hand, left for a woman who had made a whole life out of exactly that, out of plain things kept faithfully in a place the world had abandoned. When the others had gone back down in the long, slow line, and the light began to gold along the ridge, Della stayed. She sat on the mended sill of the cabin doorway with her father's coat about her shoulders, and Barley grazed the first green shoots at the edge of the clearing where the snow had pulled back, and the seep at the south end ran clear and empty now of everything but water, and the 7 markers stood upright and named along the north edge, catching the last of the sun. Ellis had offered, before he went down, to have the cabin rebuilt for her, a proper house, seasoned timber, a sound roof, and she had thanked him and told him no, not yet, that the ruin had been made a home once by a woman with far less than she had, and that she wanted to learn to keep it as it was before she let anyone improve it. She thought she might stay the summer at least. She thought she might tap the pines and clear the old garden, ground where Aveline had grown food for a boy, on a shelf of frozen mountain, and learn by her own hands what that woman had known. And let the place teach her what 40 years of townsmen had been too comfortable to climb up and learn. Effie was gone from the end of the street within the month, gone to live out her last seasons with the granddaughter of the family that had taken her in as a child of 4, and the cane chair stood empty against the wall for real now, and this time when a boy spoke of burning it for kindling, no one in Harrow Bend would let him, because the town had learned at last whose chair it had been, and what she had sat in it waiting for, and how long. The sun went down off the ridge, and the shelf went blue, and the first star pricked out cold and steady over the pass that had closed behind a company of the hopeful 40 years before, and had opened again at last to let their truth come down. Barley crossed the clearing and set his muzzle against Della's shoulder and breathed out one long, warm breath into the cooling air, and she leaned her cheek into the hollow above his eye for the length of that breath. And then she looked out over the quiet shelf and the named stones and the mended door at her back, and she spoke into the still air, not to the horse and not to the mountain, but to the woman who had waited in the ground for someone to come. I did not buy a graveyard, she said. I brought a family home. She sat with the horse until the blue went out of the air, and the stars stood thick and clear over the high country, and the shelf around her was quiet. And the quiet was no longer the silence of a thing kept hidden, but the deep, even stillness of a thing, at long last, set down and allowed to rest.